and you can take it away, Dr. Brookhart.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. We have at least one person who's not with us because her father's in the hospital. And we have another person who says he's going to hop on at 8 after his previous Zoom. He's a busy fellow tonight. So I'm going to just get started anyway and try to share my screen. Which there. All right, if I did that right, you should be able to see slides. Yes, yay. Okay, the learning goals for the series haven't changed. This is the second didactic session. The first one you already had. This one tonight will be kind of like a class as well. And then the next session is all you. We're going to be workshopping your work. 3 people have already turned in their learning target, their lesson with the learning targets, with a learning target success criteria and a performance of understanding, and gotten feedback from me. And the rest of you have a little bit of time left to do that. But the goal for the session is sessions, all 3 of them, how to use learning targets and success criteria in arts lessons, how to help students use learning targets and success criteria to develop an identity as a learner. And that's one of those connections with equity, diversity, and inclusion. The more a student feels that they are present, they have an identity as a learner, and that what they bring with them comes into the classroom and helps them be a learner, the better it is. And that is not my work, that's other people's work. But the idea is that it's not about what we teach, it's about what they learn. And so we'll talk a little bit about how the formative learning cycle, and especially using learning targets and success criteria, support equity, diversity, and inclusion, because the students are the ones who have to, the formative learning cycle gives all students access to the criteria for good work, and it gives all students a process that they can use to pursue good work. So the first thing we're going to do is simply review quickly what we did last week, because it's been, or last month, because it's been a whole month. And then the structure of the main work for tonight is, I have some frequently asked questions that come from a professional learning community I did with New York arts teachers a couple of years ago. And so I have brought their frequently asked questions into tonight. And then what I'll do is ask if any of you have questions, frequently or otherwise asked, and we'll talk about those. And that will lead us into my reminding you that you still do have a task to do, because the people who do the work are the ones who do the learning. And then I have an extended example of the use of learning targets and success criteria in music. You may remember last time, all of the examples I gave were about 1 slide size. They were little examples, which is great for an introduction. But this extended example in music, the music teacher is able to explain what she did across the unit, learning lesson by lesson, and what a difference it made in her students. And then if we have time, I have a little video from some New York arts teachers reflecting on what using learning targets and success criteria did for them, as in when they used it in their work. And if we don't have time, I'll show that next time. Come on. So lesson has a learning target. This is review. You should remember this, that when students know what they're aiming to learn and are in fact aiming to learn it, A lesson does not have a learning target if you write on the board a learning target. If it's still just your target, it's not a learning target living in the lesson. If students are aiming to learn something, then the lesson has a learning target. And you get that to happen partly by using a learning target statement. We think in words. It's good to have it articulated. In language, students can understand. And you don't just write it on the board, you unpack it, talk about it, introduce it, help them see what they're trying to learn, because that sets up the self-regulation cycle. You can't regulate your learning until you have a goal to regulate it to. The lesson, a performance of understanding, the students have to do something to learn. And so their performance, whatever it is that you get them to do in the lesson, will show them what it is that they're trying to learn. And so it needs to be a really close match with that target. And it also, and here's where the assessment part comes in, produces evidence. When students do something, you can see what they do and others can see what they do. And that's evidence of how they're learning. And then the secret sauce, the most important part as far as getting this to work, is that there need to be criteria, things to look for to monitor the students' progress so that they can gauge what they're learning, you can gauge how they're learning, and they can figure out what to do next. Every lesson should have all three of these things. And one of the things that after last week, upon reflection, I should have said louder, is that every lesson has a learning target. There is always a larger unit goal or standard or something that you're working to, but the lessons piece by piece move students toward that. And every student should be able to say to themselves, answer the question for themselves, you know, what am I doing? Why is my seat in the chair right now? What am I supposed to be learning? And they ought to have an answer for that question. And if they don't, what they're doing is old-fashioned compliance, where students, yeah, you know, I will do this for Mr. Smith because he's a great teacher and I love him. He asked me to do it, I'll do it. But that's compliance. That's not trying to learn something. And cognitively and affectively, that makes a huge difference. If a student is doing something just to comply with the teacher's direction, as compared with if a student is doing something in order to try and learn something that they're aware of trying to learn. And the whole thing is the learning target. There is a misconception out there that the learning target statement, I can do this, or today we are learning to do that, is the learning target. And that's not true. That's an articulation of it. It's necessary for communication. But the learning target is when kids, the metaphor of the target is not red and white circles. It's aiming. I'm aiming for something, and students need to act like they're aiming for something in order for the lesson to have a learning target. So all of those things, a statement, something they're going to do, make, say, or write that helps them get a concept of what it is they're trying to learn and what that looks like, and the criteria that help them figure out how well they're learning, where they are now, what they need to do next. All of that is what sets up a learning target in a lesson. And that brings me to the formative learning cycle, which is a way to show, it's typically 3 questions. Where am I going? Where am I now? Where to next? But that's a sort of a practical way to basically show what self-regulation of learning looks like on the hoof. And students who regulate their own learning are students who have identities as learners, who have a goal, something they want to learn, and they marshal their cognition, their affect, and their behavior toward it. And that will make a student present in the lesson, give a student an identity as a learner, and actually it will help them learn better as well. And lessons that are based on learning targets support students in learning both content and how to learn. I've talked already about self-regulation of learning. We talked last time about those other three. Metacognition, you have to be aware of what you're learning and what you're thinking. Self-efficacy is the feeling that I can do this. I see what to do. The success criteria are especially important for that, because if a student is doing something and has a criterion by which they can judge how well they're doing it, then they can use that information to do better. And then self-determination, being the captain of your own little ship of learning, that too sets up kids for social and emotional well-being in the classroom and just plain learning. Okay, I think that may be the end of our review session. No, this one is the end of our review session. In New York, they're using Goldie Muhammad pursuits of learning as part of the basis of how they do, how they think of social and emotional learning, and how they think of culturally relevant, historically responsive literacy. And there are 4 things that she looks for. She says, you're teaching students something about their identity. Their identity has to be present in the lesson. They have to be present in the lesson. You're teaching them some skills. You're teaching them some intellect, by which she means thinking, higher order thinking, that you can, that students have a command of the material, not just can recite it. And criticality, the students can speak truth to power. They can recognize when things need to be called into question, and they have the skills and the intellect to do that. All right. Learning target statements. Learning target statements describe what students will learn in today's lesson in language students will understand from the point of view of students who are learning it for the first time. That's a learning target statement says what students will learn from the lesson. The performance tells what students will do. And if you just say the performance, boys and girls, today we're going to make a painting, then they cannot as easily realize what it is they're supposed to learn from doing that. So you need both. Success criteria describe the work, describes things to look for, and those students can use for self-assessment, peer assessment. You can use them for giving feedback, and eventually, after all the practice is over, you can use them for giving grades. Okay, and that's the end of our review. Before I go on to tonight's new material, does anybody have a question about that quick trip through the content from last time? Okay, hearing none. Here I have selected 4 questions that participants in a previous arts professional learning community asked, and I've answered them with examples from other arts teachers' lessons. One question is, can you have more than one learning target in a lesson? One is it ever okay to list something students are going to do as a learning target? Remember, I just said it's not. Should I make the success criteria explicit at the start of the lesson? And if some students don't meet a learning target in a lesson, what should you do in the next lesson? Which is a real good question. So here we go. Let's start with the first question. Can you have more than one learning target in a lesson? You can, but be thoughtful about it. I think Carol from I didn't see her on the roster tonight, but from our last session, said she always gives her students an academic content standard related learning target, and also some sort of social emotional learning target, like I'm going to be able to collaborate with my peers to do this or that. you can do that. I have a couple examples of this. You don't want to have like a laundry list of learning. The purpose of a learning target is to focus a student's attention. So if there's a big list of things, that divides the student's attention. So first example is actually only has one learning target. This is the second lesson in a unit about painting landscapes. What are landscapes? Who paints them? I can paint one. Here's how to do it. And they really, they're at the beginning, the first lesson was just what is a landscape? What are some examples? Some painters have painted landscapes. The second one was sketching a first draft of a landscape, and that is the learning target for her second lesson. I can sketch a draft landscape, but look at the success criteria. I'll know my draft landscape is a good one when it fills up the space, has a visible foreground, middle ground, and background, shows distance through those various ways that you can show distance in a two-dimensional space, and uses overlapping. So she doesn't have 4 learning targets. Her learning target is, I'm going to learn to write how to make a landscape that actually looks like a landscape. But here are 4 things that I'm going to need to make sure I have going for my landscape in order for it to be a good one. So first, if you're thinking you need a whole bunch of learning targets, make sure it isn't that you've got 1 learning target, or maybe 2, and a whole bunch of criteria. It's quite common to have 3 or 4 or even more criteria to look for in the work. That's good, but it's all in service of, in this case, I'm going to be able to draw a landscape, and then later on they were going to paint it. So first, make sure that you're not overdoing it. I've had teachers sometimes want to put everything in that learning target statement. One of the reasons I kind of protested so hard about a learning target statement is just a statement, but it also includes something the students are going to do and criteria, and that all of those carry the information about what you're trying to learn. Is that if you don't get that, and if you don't do it that way, you do sort of want to write a great big laundry list of things that to pay attention to in the lesson. And that's really not, you don't want students doing that. You want them thinking about what they're trying to learn and then all the bits they need to get there. Here are some examples, or here is an example of a lesson that actually does have 2 learning targets. I'm learning how the tactics of character, this is a theater one. They're writing plays. It's the 6th lesson in a whole unit. The ultimate outcome of which is they will have written plays. I am learning how the tactics a character uses to achieve their objective creates their character traits. Objective in this sense is used in the theater sense. What does the character want to have happen in this story? And the second one is I'm learning how to fully develop the characters. And there's some activities that he's going to do. And the success criteria are the tactics strong enough to describe the character? Does the character have character traits? And is the character fully developed? They didn't write it as a list there, but I see 3 separate things in there. But anyway, they have this particular lesson has 2 in it, and they're sort of intertwined. The tactics that the character uses to achieve their objective and their character traits are part of how you develop a character fully. So that one has 2 because they go together, and you really couldn't teach the one without the other. So that's an example there. Is it ever okay to list something students are going to do as a learning target? I really wanted to say no. I really did. Because people are always so tempted to put the do's in the learning target, and that gets you want kids focusing on the greater purpose, the learning, not just what they're going to do. Too much about the do kicks kids back into that compliance mentality. However, couldn't quite bring myself to do it, given that sometimes in arts lessons, skills are part of what they're going. I'm learning how to use the brush with watercolors differently than I used the brush with acrylics. I'm doing something, or I'm learning how to do something. But I would press you to say, if at all possible, cast it as a learning and not a skill. But anyway, here is an example that you'll see more of. This is part of the extended example you'll see at the end. And this one has 3 learning targets in the first lesson and the second lesson. They're learning how to play the guitar. They've never played the guitar before. At the end of the unit, they're going to be able to play a chord progression that will allow them to sing Let It Be in the school, in a concert. So they're going from 0. They've had in previous, they know what rhythm is, they know what melody is, but they have never touched a guitar till this unit. And so they're starting back at the beginning, or what are the parts of the guitar? How do I hold it? But that third one there, I can strum the guitar in a clear, smooth manner. I'll give you that that's something they're going to learn how to do. The first learning target in that third lesson there, I can play the chord progression G, E minor, C, and D in whole notes. That's a do. But it's a performance, and it's almost as much a physical skill as it is cognitive. And it's only with that kind of performance stuff that you would use a do as a learning target. And I begrudgingly realize that, but go for the learn. What are you trying to learn? Should I make the success criteria explicit at the start of the lesson? Yes. Yes, I wanted to make that even bigger. The success criteria being explicit helps the kids know what it is that they're trying to learn. Just being able to say, oh, I'm going to draw a landscape, that doesn't help them. It's when they learn that has to fill the space, that it has to have depth to it, that it has to have realistic rocks and trees, that whatever it is that you're looking for, that's when the concept of what it is that they're going to have to go through to learn gets fleshed out. And I have an example of success criteria here for this was a 2nd grade music rubric, and they didn't do all this at once. They did tempo first. So the first lesson in the unit was the difference between fast and slow, presto and largo. And then they did dynamics. The next lesson was about loud and soft. And then they did matching a steady beat. And then gradually they put it all together so that they could, and eventually they were doing cool stuff like predicting what you would write for, like a bunny rabbit running real fast. It would be soft, but it would be fast, and things like that. But anyway, they needed to know what these things were, and so you deliver them right at the beginning of the lesson. Okay, here's an example that I think is interesting about the success criteria in the form of guiding questions. This was first grade dance. And then the next slide is a not first grade looking rubric that the teacher was going to use to actually evaluate their dances. So she just used the success criteria as guiding questions. And she deliberately didn't say I, she said, did the dancer, working on their identity, did the dancer. Did the dancer enter the stage by using walking feet and a quiet body? Did the dancer begin and end in stillness? No wiggles or giggles. First graders know what that is. Were the actions and levels in the dance easy to see, or were they difficult to see? And did the dancer perform the sequence in the correct order? And those were what she introduced to the success criteria to the first graders, because that's how first graders could think about that. The rubric itself, it's the same stuff, but it's way above first grade. It's for the teacher to use to evaluate their dance. There is a line missing there. I did not, I just copied what she shared with me. But there are actually four criteria there. The beginning and ending in stillness one, entering and exiting, being clear about each element in the dance, each action, and getting the sequence properly. And yeah, if the students had not had those success criteria shared with them at the beginning, they wouldn't have been able to do what they needed to do. Okay, if some students do not meet a learning target in a lesson, what should you do in the next lesson? Well, this is a question about instructional follow-up, not really learning targets and success criteria, but it's a reasonable question. And the usual there's some usual instructional follow-up strategies that you can use. But the first thing I want to say is if everybody or most of the students don't meet a learning target in a lesson, you should reteach. Feedback is not, if they haven't gotten to the point where they need feedback, don't act like they have. If most of the students miss the point, do another lesson with the same learning targets and success criteria, but with a different learning activity, different performance of understanding, so that they have another chance to practice whatever it is that they're supposed to be learning. But if most of them meet the learning target in a lesson, then in the next lesson, of course, learning targets need to be in sequence, or little beads on a string toward that larger goal. Each lesson needs a learning target. And if you told me this is the learning target for the lesson, unless you told me where it was in the sequence, I couldn't tell you whether it was appropriate or not, because I'd need to know what targets they'd met before. So yes, you can go on, but there are lots of ways to bring in people as you're going on. One is feedback. Feedback to the whole class, feedback to small groups, or feedback to individuals on their work. Students tend to like feedback to individuals on their work best, if you can do that. But you can also give whole group or small group feedback sometimes. A lot of you weren't pressing down the guitar strings hard enough, so the notes didn't come out clearly. So let's work on that, or whatever. Revise, practice, revisit. The next lesson shouldn't be completely divorced from the previous lesson. The next lesson should follow from the previous lesson. So if it should be slightly more complex, or slightly more, require slightly more fluency in playing the music or singing, or slightly more refined technique in the paint or whatever, but it should grow from the previous one. And that will allow the students who are still working to grow as well. Make sure that when you do have the next lesson learning target, that what part of unpacking it is telling the students how this lesson does come from the previous lesson. So that, yesterday we learned to play these two chords. Now we're going to learn to use those same two chords, but we're going to learn to go from one to the other smoothly, so someone could actually sing with that, or whatever it is. Sometimes within a class, you can go on, but you can have a targeted review or a little mini lesson at the beginning or even in the middle, as students are doing their work, to help the students who didn't meet before. You can have a class discussion that is of a formative nature. You can say, let's talk about, this is what we're going to do today. But before we get there, let's talk about what you learned yesterday, what questions you still have, where you see yourself needing practice. The students are usually quite forthcoming about that, as long as there's no punishment allowed. If it's safe to say, this is what I did well, and this is where I still need work. And students can help each other talk about that. And then you can also use grouping as an instructional follow-up strategy. If you use heterogeneous groups where there's a mixture of student ability with, not ability in general, but ability with regard to whatever you just did yesterday, then the students can help each other get up to speed as they do the current work. I'm a big fan of heterogeneous grouping for learning activities, for performances of understanding. Sometimes people think of grouping and they think of putting together kids that are advanced and kids that are behind. And if you group all the kids who are behind and then give them some of the same work they're already behind on, that's the recipe for getting them behind her. Heterogeneous grouping, and remember, in a regular class, you're not talking about huge discrepancies. You're talking about a kid who did get yesterday's learning target, and a kid who almost, but didn't quite get yesterday's learning target, in the same group, practicing the same stuff, helping each other out. You're not talking about people who are going to be talking past each other most of the time in most classes. So use heterogeneous grouping for the next lesson, and that can help too. There are all kinds of other, that's just instructional follow-up 101. There are lots of instructional strategies you can use to help students pick up and go along. And as I said, if they really didn't get it, then teach it again. Okay. So before you be thinking about questions that you still have as you are on your way to your assignment, which is actually not all that long. You're already doing a larger Connected Arts Network unit. Pick one of those lessons, or do it for all of them, because you really should do it for all of them. Give me the learning target, success criteria, and student performance for one of those lessons. Or if you've got all of your lessons already fleshed out, just highlight the one you want feedback on from me. And remember that each lesson needs a learning target and success criteria. So I'm only going to look at one, well, unless you want me to look at more than one, just for the sake of not making your assignment too long. But every lesson should have a learning target. And that's what this practice for you is getting. Eventually, it should be second nature. It should not take any extra time planning. It probably will at the beginning, just like any new thing has a learning curve. But the switch is in the mindset that you switch from what am I going to teach to what are they going to learn. That's the genius part of it. And I can say that because wasn't my genius. It's a bunch of educational psychologists who have figured that out. But in your Connected Arts Network unit, pick at least one lesson, highlight the learning target, success criteria, and student performance for that lesson, and upload it as a Word or PDF document in that link which you have had before and you will have again. I have 3 of them already. 3 of you have already uploaded them and got feedback today, actually, via email. I've sent the feedback. So the rest of you have another week till April 10th. The reason I'd like you to get it in by then is so that I have a little time to take what you've given me and pick out the parts that we're going to use next time in our May session for us to talk about. Because the next session is not me showing you slides. Well, I'll put it on slides, but the next session is you talking about the work you have done. So with that in mind, and Jess, I think we'll send you this link again also in email so that you have it. With that in mind, what questions do you have about how to integrate learning targets and success criteria and performances of understanding into your Arts Network units? There's a few of enough of us that we can just do this by talking. Just unmute yourself and speak.
I do have a question. Hi, this is Tanisha. So my admin wants us to write our learning targets in a little bit of a different way. So it's directly associated with, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh,
Go
okay.
ahead, Tanisha.
Connected to by. So I can learn to do ... by, and then perhaps saying how they're going to learn it during the lesson. So I mean, it's in line with what you're presenting, but it just looks a little bit different. And sometimes I find myself putting in too much with the by. I don't know if that makes sense.
It does make sense. And that's
Yes, my administrators like the same thing. They wanted to say, I can do this by.
I will not criticize your administrator, but I will say that what that sounds like to me is a learning target statement. I am learning to, or I can, or however they want to say it. Today we are learning to. It doesn't have to have the word can in it, but it has to be a statement of what you're going to learn. And then when you say by, what typically would come after is what I'm calling the performance of understanding. By doing, I'm going to learn this by doing something. Is that what they mean, Tanisha?
Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm.
Okay, well then I would, you have to use the format you've been given. That's okay with me for this assignment, but I will understand, and you might even want to write me a little note if that's what you're doing, so that I don't say, whoa, you've got too much in the learning target statement. I will understand that as 2 of the parts, the learning target statement and the performance of understanding, or in the language that I was using a couple of slides ago, they've got the learn and the do in the same sentence. Now, logically, that makes sense. Why I typically separate, and not just me personally, but there are other people who do it this way too. It is because what I want the kid focusing on is what I'm going to learn. I'm going to learn this. And if it gets too long, it's hard for a kid, a student, even a pretty old student, to keep all that in their head. And also, sometimes you learn something by doing this today, And that tomorrow, you know, I'm going to learn how to, I don't know, I'm going to make something up. It might not turn out to be a smart lesson, but I'm going to learn about dynamics by listening to this recording today. Tomorrow, I'm going to learn more about dynamics by performing something. And then I'm going to, you know, there might be 3 or 4 lessons about dynamics in music, soft and loud, and several different things they're going to do. And that's fine. You wouldn't teach everything about dynamics in one lesson, but by would change each time. and I would say then the learning target. Remember, I said if any one part changes, the learning target changes. So long story short, yes, yeah, put it the way you've been asked to put it. I am glad your administrator wants to see learning targets. And I'm hopeful that that also means they want to see learning targets used, because you writing them is not really the point. You writing them so that you can use them with your students, that's when you have a learning target. But yeah, and I will just interpret that as 2 things in one sentence. Somebody else, and my screen is set up so I don't have everybody's picture here at once. Somebody else said they had a similar, their administrator wanted a similar format. Who was that?
Yeah, that was me.
And who is me?
This is Shauna.
Shauna.
I put an example in the chat. So
Okay.
for example, you know, I would write, let's see, I can create a 2-line pattern by repeating and alternating 2 different lines.
Okay. That is fine for this assignment. And are there other ways to create a 2-line pattern?
Not really within the confines of this project.
Okay.
I don't.
So maybe that is maybe that is the learning target. What is the performance of understanding? What are they going to actually do?
They're designing sneakers by placing 2-line patterns in every different space of the sneaker design.
Okay. All right.
But then they also have to create a when they color it, they also have to create a pattern with the colors by alternating and repeating 2 different colors. So that's the next lesson.
Okay. I'm going to say that's all right. You will find people who will start to say those sentences can start to get a little big for a student who hasn't done this before to wrap their head around.
Okay.
But I can learn about, I'm learning about 2-line patterns by repeating and alternate. That isn't a huge one. How old are these students?
5th grade. So yeah, 10,
Okay.
11.
Yeah, okay. As I said, that if you have a formula you have to use, it doesn't make, to me, it doesn't make sense for me to say for this assignment, I want you to do it this way, when you can in fact use it. I think you should go with the learning target format that you are being asked to use.
I've just gotten into the habit of always looking for the word by in it and making sure I have it and making sure just it's become a habit now because I know they look for it.
Okay. How are your students? Has this been fine for your students? You haven't run into people, kids that think, you know, for whom these sentences get too long and complicated and they can't use them?
Not so far, because depending on the grade, you know, we might spend 2 different classes on the same on the same criteria. So I might word it a little bit simpler the first time we do it, and then make it a little more specific when we revisit the lesson for the next class.
And that actually is a typical, as learning targets move on, what you do is you go deeper, you get more complex. You repeat's the wrong word, you spiral around, and instead of just the introductory level, now we do that. That is standard good practice as far as I know.
Yeah,
So-
they need it, so it's grown out of them needing it more than me knowing I should do it, to be honest.
Well, then you have you have discovered a principle, a learning principle. Learning happens, but well, when I was a kid, actually the art that I love to do myself, I'm not an expert by any means, but I played piano. I'm 70 years old. I started taking lessons when I was 4, and I still play the piano. Again, not, you notice I'm an educator, not a musician, but I can remember as a kid, my mother would say, practice makes perfect. And that was long before anybody told me I should be aiming to learn anything. It was just sit at that piano bench and practice, but it works. And after enough, now what would have worked better if I had been not just sitting there thinking I have to play this piece 5 times before I'm allowed to get up off this piano bench, and been thinking more like I would really like to be able to play this Mozart a little faster. But you know, practice is not static. And now I'm not actually talking about learning targets, I'm talking about learning theory, but practice helps students go over things if I'm a reading teacher, I'd call it fluency, for just getting it into your bones. If you were a math teacher, you want the kids to do the math facts fast, not because you really care about fast, but because that's a signal that they're actually learning them deeply. So and practice always should build, you know, today's practice should be better than yesterday's practice. It should be more fluent. It should be more more even. If it's painting, there should be refinements that make it better than last time's. And so that's, and you can use that as part of an inspiration for your next learning target in this series. So yesterday we painted this, and today we're going to add to that by focusing on something else that will refine it in some way. But yes, you go over things over and over again. How did you learn to be a good painter? You painted a whole lot of stuff before you said, oh, I'm a pretty good painter. So I guess the short answer to the question I've been asked is, if you have to use that learning target format with a by in it, because you have been required to do that, then do it for this assignment. Other questions, other frequently asked or not so frequently asked questions about you, either for this assignment or for using learning targets and success criteria in your own classes. Gail, is that?
Yeah. Hi.
Yeah.
I
Hi.
had a quick question.
Yes.
Sounds like she's might be frozen, Sue.
Oh,
Oh,
yeah.
am I frozen? Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Jess, but I don't. Gail is frozen, I think.
Oh,
What can we do
There
about that?
there she is. There she is. We can hear you now,
Am I
Gail.
back? Okay,
Okay, yes. Can you start
Um,
again and ask the question?
yes. I listened to the YouTube video that from last time. And my question is, you said you start with the standard, then you go to the learning target, then you go to the success criteria. But can you go the other way? Like if I know what I want my students to do, and this is the success that I want them to have, these are the criteria, and then go to, well, how am I going to do the learning target? Or is there a beginning and ending, or can you go back and forth, or that's basically the question.
It's a good question. Typically, people are advised to start with the standard because that defines the
My
learning.
question,
Uh-oh.
you said there's the standard.
Okay, I think that was just a repeat of her question. So typically, people want you to start with the standard because that's what you're aiming to teach. But there are, and it's not just in art, there in English and math. I have also run into teachers who say, I know what I want them to be able to do. And so for you, the question then to reason back from that is, okay, what do I want them to learn by doing that? And that's the learning target. And that shouldn't be too hard. If you want them to do something and you're not, out there somewhere, there's probably a reason you want them to do that. And it's probably got to do with you want them to learn something about your art. So just ask yourself, what do I want them to learn by doing that? As opposed to when I was back, I don't want to tell you how many years ago when I was in the classroom. I used to do Friday afternoon art projects that were really more like craft projects. And I didn't care that the kids learned any art. We were just decorating the classroom and having a good time. We made origami frogs and little things you could hang from the lights just for fun. That's not learning. That's having fun on a Friday afternoon. If you want them to do something that you think will be educative for them, I bet under there somewhere, there's something you want them to learn about. And that's how you get back to reasoning about the learning. And then, of course, you'll probably have to say, okay, what standard is this for? Because we teach, that's your contract says you'll teach the standards. So, but yes, you can reason backwards. And if you run into a wall and geez, I don't know what I want them to learn by doing this, then ask yourself, okay, do I really need them to do this? Because if they're not going to learn something related to the art I'm supposed to be teaching them, then maybe they shouldn't be doing that during that class. But yeah, most of the time, if you've got a do in your mind, if you just ask yourself, what are they supposed to learn? You'll get there.
Thank you.
You're welcome. How about other questions related to learning targets that you need to start that again. Before I go on to the extended example, I want to make sure that all of you could leave this session thinking, I know what I need to do at least to get one lesson's worth of learning target, performance of understanding, and success criteria uploaded to Sue. And I'd love it if that was also, and I know what to do to put a learning target, performance of understanding, and success criteria in all my lessons. And the big catch, and have students use them. Just having them doesn't do you any good. The students have to use them. You have to build into your lesson. They're going to use those criteria as they work. I'm going to give them a pause point to stop and reflect. I'm going to do peer assessment or do something where they use them. And before I go into the extended example, which is several slides long, I want to make sure everybody's feeling like you got your head around that. I'm seeing at least a couple of bouncing heads.
I had a quick question, if you don't mind.
Do not mind. Elizabeth?
Elizabeth, yeah, I just took a shower, so my hair is wet, so I'm off camera. But I've been here the
Okay.
whole time. Learning targets, I always connect them with the criteria. So, and then
That's a
that,
good thing.
and then that in turn lends itself to the rubric that's created. It's all intertwined. So I feel like sometimes it's hard for me to segment the learning target, the performance indicator, the success criteria, because I feel like it's all embedded in one, in a sense. So for example, when we were looking at the draft landscape slide that you showed earlier,
Mhm.
the person had, a bunch of criteria down that all, for me, look like they were learning targets within themselves. So like they want to create a landscape, but they need to learn how to overlap to show distance. For me, overlapping to show distance, different wording I would put, but that would be a learning target. And then essentially that's part of the rubric. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, I absolutely do.
Okay.
The first thing to say is you're correct. The learning target is the whole thing. It's the
Mhm.
statement and the criteria
Mhm.
and they're going to do something that'll give you evidence.
Okay.
Okay. So just saying, I'm going to sketch a landscape, as my mother used to say, that and a dime will get you a cup of coffee. Of course, that doesn't work anymore. It's that and $4.50 will get you a cup of coffee. But
Mhm.
just saying I'm going to sketch a first landscape won't help. You
Mhm.
need all those criteria. And if this had been these students' first experience with overlapping, they might need a whole lesson just on overlapping.
Mhm.
And
That's
how that
Mhm.
did distance.
Mhm.
So so it might be that for some classes that you teach, ways to show distance would be a whole lesson. In fact, I'm sure for Deb's the art teacher who did this her name is Debbie Rich. She's an award-winning art teacher in the New York City School District, and she did 2 years of a Learning Target PLC with me. She is she's still with us, is fabulous. And she, I'm sure, had students that or had classes where she did showing distance as a whole lesson.
Mhm.
So yes, the test of let me start that sentence again. The success criteria flesh out the learning target statement for the kids.
Mhm.
The performance makes it concrete because they're going to have to actually do something. It all needs to match, and it's all part of, you can't learn without any one part of it.
Mhm.
And all three of those things help students focus on the learning and not just, oh, I'm drawing a landscape. Boys and girls, today we're going to draw a landscape. Everybody's landscape look like this. And depending on where you are in your sequence of learning, you might have a bigger or smaller learning target. But yes, they all go together. I separate them out
Mhm.
because it's like a three-legged stool. You can't have a learning target without all those parts.
Mhm.
And if you try and smush it all into call it a learning target period, you end up with those whole paragraph learning targets that nobody can use.
Mhm.
And what gets short shrift usually is the success criteria. And they're so important. And your final point is that success criteria, yes, they are part of a rubric or can be part of a rubric. Sometimes when you have a rubric for a final performance, you teach about one criterion at a time or one or two at a time, and they gradually learn them. Sometimes it's you work on all the criteria at once. It depends on what you're trying to teach and the level of your students. But yes, if you have a rubric, sometimes that is the success criteria. Rubrics are a way to package success criteria. Guiding questions are another way to package success criteria, like the first grade dance feature. Did you start and end in stillness? Checklists, that's another way. Sometimes demonstrations. The video I showed at the end of the last one was of a dance teacher who showed what it was like to make 3 elements into I think he called it a movement sentence into a dance. And he basically said, do it this way. And then he danced it for them. You can, and the criterion was, does my dance follow the same format as his? So rubrics are not separate from success criteria. They are the success criteria. And sometimes you teach them a few at a time. You don't always teach them all at once. Did that help, Elizabeth?
Yes, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I apologize. I'm not looking you in the eye.
No,
It's
that's
a little awkward every time I don't have the camera on. But
that is perfect. It's nighttime probably where you are. It's only 5:30 in the evening where I am. So, but it's nighttime for lots of you, and I understand.
thank you very much.
Okay, other questions before we watch an extended example? Because this is the most important part. You know, it's more important for you to get your head straight about how you're going to do it than to watch one more example of how another teacher did it. Having said that, there's nothing like a good example to teach. So this one is mostly, and I'm making an assumption there. We can move on? Yes? Yes. All right. Get back to where I was. This is an example from middle school music. I already told you these kids it was their guitar unit, and they all got to use school guitars, and they had never done guitar before. So it was, you know, that is daunting to me. I tried to pick up a guitar in high school because, of course, they were cool, and I couldn't teach myself how to play guitar, not even with one of those beginner guitar books. And I could play the piano. How hard could it be? You need to learn some things. You need to know what you're trying to learn. So here's this class full of kids trying to learn to play the guitar, because this is the guitar unit. And this is when they get to use the school guitars. So I already showed you as an example of, she had several learning targets, but if you notice, first, it was just what I would call orientation. Then they learned how to read just 3 chords, G major, E minor, and C major. And then, and believe me, it was slow. Chung, chung. And then they put them together. And there was a lot of that because they were going to actually perform this for people. So there were criteria. They were looking for a clear resonant sound, a steady tempo, that the strumming had to be on the beat, because eventually people were going to have to sing to this. They had to be in correct posture relative to the guitar, with correct fingering on the strings. Pretty standard stuff, but that's okay. That's what you have to learn if you're going to learn to play the guitar. Now, for Elizabeth's benefit, you see this rubric, and I love the levels she named them. Instead of 4, 3, 2, 1, she called it Rockstar, Jingle Bells, Hot Cross Buns, and Fisher Price Piano. That's a little smart alecky, but I like it, and I guess her kids did too. This is the rubric she was aiming for the final performance, and she showed it to the kids. But this was way more than the success criteria for any one lesson. would be. They worked for a long time on just producing the secure tone, and then being able to do it on the beat, not, you know, stopping every so often and interrupting themselves. And then, but eventually they knew this is what they were aiming for. And in any lesson, they worked on one or more of these criteria. They did, they used formative assessment. They did a glow and grow method, so that they had to say one good thing and one suggestion for improvement. And that's what I'm going to show you in this. It's a phone video. The video is not very good, but what I want you to look at is these kids are actually using success criteria to give each other feedback. So let me show it.
1, 2, ready, end. 2, 3, 3, 4. Okay. So 1 glow and 1 grow. Jacqueline, give me a glow.
Glow. She played right on the beat.
She played on the beats correctly. Good. Okay, Hannah.
Maybe she could
Wait, is this a glow or a grow?
a grow.
A grow. Okay, so tell her, not me.
You should probably press the beats a little harder. Yeah, probably. Or the strings.
Okay, so the strings can be pressed harder. Okay, so with that in mind, we're going to try it again, okay? 1, 2, ready, end. 2, 3, 4, 3. Okay, so what happened?
For the middle one, when I pressed it, I leaned on it, so I messed up.
You were leaning on what?
On another string, so I went like this, but then I leaned.
And what chord was that?
The C.
Can you try the C chord now?
I feel like it's because I was rushing that I wasn't too.
Okay, great. Nice. So if your next steps, if you're going to practice this at home, what would you do next?
I would get my pace better, pace it better, and not lean on the strings, practice for that.
Practice, would you start practicing at the same tempo or would you change the tempo to practice?
At the same tempo, so I can get used to it.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Okay. Now that, get back to my. Need to, hang on a minute, I need to bring up my slide again.
While you're doing that, can I jump in with a comment?
Absolutely.
So out of the success criteria that you had, I like it. And the one thing that struck me though is, and I'm saying this because I experienced this recently with my group of kids playing ukuleles, and I've done a guitar unit with them in the past, is the notion of correct fingering. And that was something, if we're talking, equity, diversity, inclusion, liberation, that's a very Eurocentric thing of there's a correct way to play. So some students were questioning me, and I really had to have a look at it, and I said, well, of course we've all been taught what the finger position, which finger to use for like a C chord or a G chord or D chord or E minor, whatever it is. But some students were struggling with that. And it came down to me just wrestling with myself. And I finally got down to, I said, no, if I'm going to really instill the principles of equity, diversity, inclusion, SEL, to let these kids be at the most comfortable space, use whatever fingering is best for you. The important thing is that you are learning the chord progressions and you are learning where the placement are on the string and the fret. Once we did that, it was like a whole different world for some of these kids. They were more engaged. They weren't as apprehensive. They were just they were trying their best, is what my thing is. So that's the only part of that the criteria that I would question. Just language that like that to say, and ask the person to revisit that to say correct fingering. And I'm wondering if the student that's featured in the video, that last chord where she was having issues, if she were allowed to really just figure out which fingers work the best for her, rather being told you got to use 1, 2, 3, 4 or whatever, fingerings, maybe she would have more success and feel like, oh, wow, I can do this because this really fits me, as opposed to some pre-described notion of, this is what the correct fingering is.
Okay. That's, since I don't play the guitar, I can tell you that in the piano world, when I used to get told what fingers to use, but as I got older, my teacher would give me a pencil and say, you have to put the fingering in, or you won't be able to learn to play it fast, but you figure out which fingers you use. So that resonates with the piano player. Cool. I am reporting what she did, and she obviously didn't do that, but that's a really interesting. The only thing I can think of is the standard fingering might be quicker to switch in the long run, but again, only for most hand sizes and shapes.
And that's it's interesting you said that, because one of the students, like when we had this discussion, brought that up as a point of why would we use quote unquote correct fingering? And they said, well, maybe it's easier to switch. I said, well, think about this. I said, do some homework on your own and bring me some videos of folks who, unfortunately may have been born with only 3 fingers, or may have, suffered an accident to where they only have the use of 2 fingers or 1 hand or the other, and then they thought about it and they were like, wow, yeah, that's true. There are guitar players who have to adapt for whatever reason. So they don't have a quote unquote correct fingering. And that was the discussion. It was pretty cool to have that with them and to go back and forth. And then, so we just landed upon, you know what? If your chord comes out sounding strong and it's sounding full, keep working at it. And I even joke, because one of my kids on ukulele likes to put their thumb over the top to do a D chord. And I said, you may actually be the first person who can switch quickly from a D chord to the other ones. I said, that means you're gonna have to work at it. However, I'm not gonna try to limit you, but it may be easier if you learn to use your other fingers. And again, just that freedom, that student was like, there was a weight lifted off their shoulders, it seemed like.
I would be all for that. I'm not a music teacher, so it's not an authoritative voice, but it sounds to me like working out of one of those principles, namely letting kids have some choice in areas that affect them. I am mindful of the time, so you're going to get the slides so you can read the rest. I just want to end with one of the things that Joella said, and you'll see a reference to a video of some other teachers' conclusions. I'll show that next time. But she had to answer these questions, were not hers. The New York City, the Arts Monday Project gave these questions to the teachers and said, answer. And she said, most ensemble teachers feel that more time needs to be spent. There's always not enough rehearsal time. She said, making students listen for these criteria and giving each other feedback actually cut down on rehearsal time that was needed, because their practicing was more targeted. It was, it wasn't trial and error. It was jumping directly to the mistakes, not holding the strings down long enough, holding on the wrong note, so that what they were fixing, it was more productive practice. And that, she said, in my 4 years of teaching this curriculum, this is the fastest I've had students learn how to put chords together for a song. And all she did, it's huge, but it was simple. All she did is what I'm asking you to do. Have the kids know what it is they're aiming for, know the criteria they're looking for, and look for them. Really, that's it. And I want to say it works. It's not that it works, it's the students are doing the work because they're focusing on what they need to focus on to learn. They're kind of learning how to learn. And that's really all it is. And yet that's huge. So because of time, I need to leave it there, but please do, the rest of you, send me your stuff by April the 10th so that I can get it organized into your next session. I will give you personal feedback via your email address that nobody else will see but you and me. Jess, is there anything else we need to say before we ring off? There she is. Jess? She's
So
talking.
it's, you would think that after all these months that I would know to unmute myself. It's been a long day, folks. I'm so sorry. So I just wanted to share first, thank you, Dr. Brookhart. You're awesome. We love you. And you're brilliant and just always make it so practical for us. So thank you. Thank you to all the teachers joining us from all over the United States. We appreciate you and the time and dedication you give to your craft, to your children, and to your community. I just want to share the screen for a second to show you what the difference between the attendance screen looks like and the assignment screens, because I think some folks, it does look similar, but they are different. So I just wanted to show that, and I'm going to stop recording because nobody needs to see this. So nobody needs to know that this is going to be recorded from here. So, oh, I'm sorry. Let me just, I'll just share my screen. There we go. Awesome sauce. So I'm just going to share this. You folks can see that. Don't mind my messy desktop. So this one here that says CAN Workshop Series, attendance, that has this light blue black background, excuse me. The one with the purple background, it has two sections. It looks similar, but this is the one that actually you will drop in at the bottom. The second section is where you drop in your file. So I will send that via email along with the PDF of the deck and the link to the YouTube recording of this so anyone can access it. Does that sound good?
Yeah, Jess, can you send the
Thank
deck
you.
for the first session also?
Yeah, I'll resend them both together. Does that sound good?
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful evening. And if you're heading out to break soon, relax, try not to work, enjoy some beautiful art and music, dance and theater, fill your cup. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, Jess. Thank you, everybody.
Bye. Thank
See you May
you.
2nd.
Take care. Take care.
Come on, come on.